Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. We've got a proper legend in the book bag today, somebody I'm very excited to be talking to about their new book. But I have picked a book bag that it's kind of expresses night time. So this is somebody who goes out a lot at night, and there's a magpie on it because I've chosen that because they're a musical magpie. So slightly corny, but I liked picking that book bag. So as I say, we have a legend coming up. I'm very excited to talk to the amazing Robert Elms. Welcome into my book bag, Robert.
Hello, Suzi.
You are a musical magpie, aren't you? I'm not wrong.
Yeah, a gadfly, my mum used to call me. I've been everything. I mean, I was a skinhead aged 10. I was a soul boy aged 14, a punk rocker at 16, a new romantic at 18. I've been a rockabilly, and I've been a jazz head, and I've been a reggae fan. I kind of love music, and I love all the stuff that goes with it. I like the clothes and the style and the gigs, and particularly the gigs, because that's what the book's about.
Absolutely. So it's this book we're talking about, Live, Why We Go Out, a paean of praise to gig going. I wanted to start with something that might amuse you, actually. Let me pull this out. Look at this. This will take you down memory lane. I bet you have a copy of this.
I do have a copy of that one. In fact, I've got every issue of The Face There Ever Was. That's my jeans. It's not my bum.
Exactly.
But it's my jeans.
Yeah. Iconic cover. And an iconic piece. Wrote the cover piece for The Face. This is, oh my God, it's only number 29, and that was September 1982. Oh my goodness. Hard Times. I actually picked this up again during lockdown because that seemed to be pretty hard times. You sort of go up into the loft and find things and think about stuff. It was quite a controversial piece, I seem to remember at the time, because you end up going, almost let's hope times get harder still, because the music that comes out of hard times is great.
Well, it was great music in that era. I mean, I think there's probably great music in every era, but I think that was a piece written very much as a reflection of the political period of the time. And this was deep Thatcherism. When I think everyone was feeling it and suffering and all of that. But what I was saying is that there's resistance to that, and that music is the sort of backdrop and almost the motor of that resistance. So that's what that piece was about. I mean, it was also a kind of a way of saying let's leave behind frills and dandyism, which I'd been kind of associated with as the whole new romantic thing, and saying, we got to toughen up a bit here because these are very tough times, and indeed they were, and they get a mention in the book because the book goes back to I went on my first gig when I was 12, and I've been going. I tried to work out how many gigs I might have been to or how many bands I might have seen, and it's somewhere I think between 3,000 and 4,000. Because I've been going to gigs since I was 14, 15, and I'm now 64. So half a century of gig going at least once a week, and often, twice a week, and often 2 or 3 or 4 bands in a week. So it's thousands and thousands and thousands of gigs.
You kind of became an accidental music critic, and you described how that happened in the book Live as well. But presumably, even by the time that happened, you started writing about music, you had been to an awful, you'd absorbed a lot, you'd listened to a lot of records, you were obsessed with music.
Yeah, I think I was quite lucky. I had 2 elder brothers, Barry and Reggie, who were a lot older, 10 years and 7 years older. And they had really good record collections. So from the age of kind of 5 or 6 onwards, I was hearing import ska records and brilliant music from Tamla Motown or Stax. That was the sort of stuff they were into. Ours was not a pop household. They had great record collections, and even my mum had records by Mahalia Jackson, and my mum had records by Tom Jones, and really good people. So I grew up in a household with lots and lots of music, but I didn't grow up in a household where you went to see live music very much. It was all about records, and then my brothers went to clubs and danced. So going to see gigs became my thing from very early on. starting with the Jackson 5, aged 13, then through Rod Stewart, then through lots of jazz funk, and then punk came along, and punk just changed my world and my trousers.
Well, one of the things that struck me about the book, it's something that journalists do. You know, we like to say that things began here and ended there, and, you know, to categorize things and put them in boxes. But by you actually being there, going to you understand that punk is not as clear cut. It doesn't just begin with the Sex Pistols. Things brew for a long time, and there's a very funny bit when you say, well, there used to be hippies at punk gigs until the punks finally chased them away, but there'd be a few loon pants in the mix.
Oh, that was entirely true. I think always these things are about continuity, really. And you know, the original mods had probably been Teddy Boys. The original punk rockers had been soul boys. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. And they'd been art students and long hair. And there was certainly a period around about 76, 77 where I would go to the Roundhouse every week because I come from Northwest London. I would go to the Roundhouse on a Sunday afternoon, and it would divide. On one side would be the sort of long haired ones with flared jeans and great coats and sitting on the floor smoking dope. And on the other side were people who'd taken very different drugs and cut their hair short and were bouncing up and down and pogoing. And there was this sort of who's going to win in this cultural war. The punk hegemony took over, and the hippies were sort of, as you say, were kind of dispersed to the wind and probably went home and got their hair cut, to be honest, most of them. Because that's how these things happen. That's how one sort of trouser tribe, as I described them, goes to another.
Well, I mean, I've always known you as a style journalist as much as a music journalist, or even more so. I mean, The Face brought that together, didn't it? It was a rather brilliant, publication in that respect, that it tied the two together, and none more so than in this cover piece.
Well, I started out, the first things I wrote, aged 19, were for the NME. But then it quickly became clear that I didn't like rock music very much. So it probably wasn't the place. Heavy metal is not my thing. Indie music is not my thing. So I was sort of a fish out of water at the NME. But thankfully, Nick Logan had started The Face 3 or 4. I think I was issue 3 when I first walked into his office and said, "Can I write for you, please, sir?" And there's this band called Spandau Ballet who are going to be the next big thing. And that was the first thing I wrote for them. And we did a cover story on Spandau, and from that point on, that was my thing. And Spandau and Sade and Blue Rondo and Boy George and all of these things, they combined music, but also with style, with the look, with street culture, if you like. And that was where I was very different. I was never going to be a rock journalist. I'm not a muso, really. I don't know a chord from a melody. I do, but not in technical terms. I don't. I'm not a musician. Never wanted to be a musician, and so mine was always much more about the effect that music has on people. And the book is about that, really. The book doesn't give you reviews and set lists and what songs people play. It's much more about how you feel, how music, how one band made you excited, how you dressed up to go and see them. It's much more about the experience of listening and following music live.
Well, that was a style pointer, wasn't it? That it's the way. I mean, I'm not into football at all, but the way you describe the whole ritual around going to see your team is very similar to the ritual around going to see the band that you absolutely love. You know, the threads have got to be right. You know, you have to prepare and get your team around you. You know, your little cohort.
Well, talking of teams, you see, because the book also intersperses my love for going to live sport, but particularly to my football team. Because actually, I don't like football. I like Queen's Park Rangers. And I've been able to watch them since I was 7. Literally, I mean, without parental guidance from about the age of 10 with my cousin who was the same age. So even before I got into music, I got into going to football. And for me, the experiences are kind of similar. I'm very partisan when I go to something. I want to feel part of it. I'm not going there just as an idle observer. In the same way as I don't go and watch football unless Queen's Park Rangers are playing. I have very little interest. I don't go and watch a band unless I'm into that music. And therefore it feels the same to me. I'm kind of cheering them on. I'm down the front. I'm excited. I'm part of the experience. Watching sport, watching football, watching music, watching cricket has never been a passive experience for me. It's why I can't watch it online. I say in the book that watching live music online is more like pornography than sex. You're not involved. You're simply an observer. Whereas if you're at the gig or you're at the match, you're there, you're part of it. You're part of the atmosphere. You're potentially even kind of changing the direction of the event. And that is what it's all about for me. It's about being there and how that makes you. And that was why the book arose out of COVID, because for that 18 months when you weren't allowed, live music was banned, literally banned. You couldn't do it. And therefore, that was when I realized how much I missed it and what a vitally important part it played in my life. Because not only do I miss the band, I miss the crowd. It's about being part of a shared experience. Live music on your own would mean nothing whatsoever. If you're sitting I've done it. I've sat in my own and watched bands, usually at sound checks or if I'm interviewing them, and it just doesn't do a thing. It's when you've got other people around you, and suddenly the experience, the joy, the pleasure, the pain, the whatever it might be, is magnified because of the presence of all of you.
Some of the gigs that you talk about, I mean, the crowds seem as entertaining, if not more so, than the actual band. And also, I mean, if you're writing about something, say the Slits, for example. The Slits is a good example because they were bloody terrible, weren't they, in musical
I saw their first ever gig and they were absolutely unlistenable. They were shambolic. They were atonal. They didn't know what they were doing. All of those things. I mean, they were useless, but they were magnificent. They were magnificent because of their attitude, because of their spirit, because of their kind of, kind of leashed, feminism of the most kind of ardent punk kind. And although they were terrible, they left a huge effect upon me. I think they literally kind of made me grow up, made me change my, I'd thought of, I was a 16-year-old kid or something. I'd thought of girls in one way before the Slits, and I thought of them in a very different way after the Slits, thankfully. And so the music doesn't always have to be great. It isn't about that. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you're going to watch absolute excellence and brilliance and elan. But other times you're going to be unleashed, to be challenged, to be excited, to be scared, to be whatever it might be. And music can do all of those things, I think, particularly when you're young. I mean, I say in the book that 9 of the 10 best gigs I've ever been to were before I was 20, because they affect you most then. You're at your most kind of sponge-like. You soak it all up. You're at your most intense. And music feels most intense when you're young, I think.
Well, let's talk about one that got away, because you could have been to see Ziggy.
Yeah,
you could have seen that gig.
I know. The first of many mistakes in my life. In 1972, I'm 13. I'd already been to a couple of gigs. I'd been to see the Jackson 5. I'd been to a few others. And a guy on my estate who I was friendly with, but he was a couple of years older than me, said, do you want to go and see David Bowie at Hammersmith Odeon? We didn't know it was Ziggy's last gig because that was only announced live then. He said, do you want to go and see David Bowie? And at that time, my hero was Rod Stewart. And still is in some ways, actually. I still think Rod is one of the greatest singers we've ever produced. But in the playground at my school, you had to sort of decide which side you were on. You were either David Bowie or you were Rod Stewart. A few were T-Rex, but the main divide was Rod or David Bowie. And I was in the Rod Stewart camp. So when my friend asked me if I wanted to go and see David Bowie at Hammersmith Odeon, and even offered me the ticket and said I could pay him later when I got the money from my milk round, I said no. I mean, it was probably the worst mistake I've made in my life, because it was that last Ziggy gig. It was one of the monumental events. It's probably still the concert that gets talked about most in London musical history. And I could have been there and I wasn't. I made that mistake a few times. I had a ticket for Fela Kuti in Brixton and didn't go. I was on the guest list to go and see Nirvana and didn't go. So every now and then I've made mistakes.
I mean, you can't see everything, can you? That's the other thing. At least you don't pretend to have gone like all the people who said they squeezed in to see the Sex Pistols.
I think for quite a long time I did say that I went to Ziggy. I've come clean in the book. I didn't, but I did see the Sex Pistols.
That was out at Brunel. Yeah,
at Brunel University, their last ever London gig, and they were also pretty terrible, but kind of magnificent. But also, the Pistols were sort of almost sad. Even then, you knew this was going to blow up. You knew it wasn't going to end well. It couldn't. It was too cataclysmic for that. But the Clash were my band back then, and I saw the Clash time after time after time. They were my kind of Queen's Park Rangers. That became my credo. They were the ones whose badges I wore, whose records I carried, who I got to know, who I went to every gig I could get to, hitchhiked here and got buses there and milk trains back from there. So I saw the Clash loads and loads and loads of times.
And were they consistent?
They were magnificent. Yeah, they were consistent, and they got better and better, I think. The first Clash gig I saw was at a tiny little porno cinema in Harlesden, with about 100 people, I think, or maybe 150 people. And that night they were life-changing. And then they just got better and better. Unfortunately as well, you see, they also got bigger and bigger. And what that means is after a while, you're not seeing them in porno cinemas in Harlesden or in little venues. They're playing big stadiums and all of that. And that's never been my thing. So I tend to lose a band when they get too big, because I've got no desire to be in a stadium or an O2, or I'll go occasionally to those big gigs, but they're not for me. I want to see the reds of their eyes. I mean, I want that intimacy and that close up and that sense of being part of it, really.
Did you find that their songwriting developed? I mean, talking about the Clash, I mean, they're kind of. I remember there was all this stuff. The music papers just endlessly talked about them selling out, didn't they? It was just, oh, have they sold out? Now they've sold out. They're going to sell out. No, it was just.
Yeah, that
something about authenticity.
That was completely preposterous. And I remember Joe saying, "Yeah, we have sold out. We've just sold out the Rainbow," and he was right. And actually, the Rainbow in London on the White Right tour is the Clash gig that goes down in history. That's when everyone ripped all the seats out, and I was there ripping those seats out. And years later, I said to Joe, I ripped out one of those seats, Joe. He said, "You owe me 50 quid. We had to pay for every single one of those." No, the Clash didn't sell out, and Joe Strummer certainly didn't. But bands do get bigger, and if you're there at the beginning, it can sometimes feel like they're not your thing anymore. And I've experienced that quite a few. Bruce Springsteen, I had the same thing. I talk in the book about seeing Springsteen in his second ever London gig, but he played 2 nights. And he was incredible, but he was poetic. He was fragile. He was small. He wasn't the boss. He wasn't this kind of beefed up stadium rock thing. He was this American poet, if you like. And that Bruce Springsteen disappeared. And I had no desire to go and see him do Born in the USA in a check shirt. It just wasn't my thing. I felt, and I sulked for quite a long time because I thought we'd lost Bruce Springsteen.
You've done lots of interviews, and I mean, you're a noted radio broadcaster. Would you say? I think what comes across from the book is that you can get the respect of even quite difficult people in music. I mean, what made Robert Elms a figure on the scene? Like you say, you don't play an instrument, you don't sing, and yet, I mean, you named Spandau Ballet, didn't you? You came
I did that. I went out with Sade.
Yes,
all of those things. What made me? I think I'm an enthusiast. I think I've always had a kind of a passion's an overused word now. It gets used on Saturday night kind of talent shows all the time. But I've always had a real lust for musical life, if you like, to almost quote Iggy Pop. I get really excited. Even today, I get excited by new stuff. I get excited by creativity. And I want to share that. And I'm quite good at sharing that. So I'm a good sort of advocate to have on your side, because I'll go out there and tell the world, because I've got a big mouth. I'm relatively good with words, and I like to share my passions with people. So I think that's what I brought to the game, to be honest, whether it was as a writer for The Face or a broadcaster on the radio. I'm a fan. But I'm also...
You could be a press advocate in a way, couldn't you? You could handle the press side of things in a way.
Yes, I could do all of that. I'm almost a sort of a press officer for those, not in any paid sense, but just for the things that I love, whether it be the latest generation of British jazz musicians, or it be, you know, the long forgotten Blue Rondo à la Turque or whatever. I'm sort of a bit of a zealot. And I think that's no bad thing to be if you're doing my job. Also, I'm relatively good, I think, at talking to people, except Miles Davis, which is a story that was...
I did cringe when I read that story. We won't discuss it because the people, you know, I want people to read your book, but
sometimes people can be
moment.
difficult. Like, I interviewed Lou Reed, for example, on radio, and Lou Reed came with a reputation for being really difficult, and he is, and he makes that part of his persona. And he came in, and he was sullen, and he was, you know, didn't want to talk and all of that. And then suddenly I managed to kind of unlock him by remembering that he'd collaborated with Ornette Coleman on the soundtrack of an obscure film. And suddenly it was apparent to him that I knew what I was talking about, that I knew my stuff. And I wasn't just some bloke who'd heard a Walk on the Wild Side a few times. And then we started talking about Street Hassle and the second part of the suite of Street Hassle and the lyrical. And suddenly he was great. And he was, and I've sort of been able to do that a fair few times to unlock difficult people, but you can't unlock all of them. You couldn't unlock Ginger Baker. He was, that didn't work.
Yeah, you don't really go into why he was problematic, but you do mention him a few times.
Well, he's problematic with everybody. Well, he's just a complete and utter... Oh, he's dead, so we can say whatever we like about him. But he was a curmudgeon of the worst kind, and he was aggressive, and he was nasty, and he was, and he liked being all of that, and he sort of, he vaguely tried to make life difficult for everybody, basically. And he succeeded. So he's not one of my favorite musicians, but he could play the drums, of that there's little doubt. Although drum solos are not my favorite thing, as I talk about in the book. You should never be encouraged. Don't cheer when they're doing a drum solo, because they'll only do another one.
I think if there's one message you want to get across, is do not shout encouragement whatsoever during the drum solo, and you never know when it's coming up, so you can't nip to the bar. You know, it happens, and you're locked in, and
suddenly they spring a drum solo on you. And the drum solo is usually all right for about the first 90 seconds or maybe even 2 minutes. And then suddenly he's off on one and someone cheers, and you just can't get them to stop. Because it's, you know, they're drummers. They're people who hang around with musicians. I mean, this is not entirely fair, but, and there are some great drummers. Charlie Watts was one of my heroes, but but there you are. But I mean, I do have other things, though. There are other bugbears, like phones at gigs. No, please put them away. I mean, some acts now, Bob Dylan has banned phones at his concerts. Ronnie Scott doesn't allow phones at gigs. And I'm with that totally. If you're going to really enjoy a gig, you've got to be there. You've got to be in the now. You shouldn't have anything distracting you. You know, whether you and looking at a gig through a phone, that's just bizarre. I think that's partly because we've got a generation that are used to looking at gigs on screens. If the venue's so big that you have to have a screen, I don't want to be there. I want to be able to see the performers from where I am. And phones are a no-no for me. I don't even like big sing-alongs, maybe for a couple of numbers at the end. But if someone's going to holler every word in my ear when I've just paid 50 quid to go and see a singer I like, and I can't hear him because the bloke behind me is doing karaoke, that's not for me.
You also don't like the big festival, you know, Glastonbury type things either. I mean, is this a sartorial thing? Would it just be, you know, too much mud on your strides?
Yes, there's an element of that, but it isn't just that. I'm not suited to mud. I'm an urban soul. I like to dress up to go to gigs. I mean, put me in a basement jazz club, you know, in Soho, I'm at home. Put me in a field somewhere near Wales and I haven't got a clue how to behave. But it isn't just that. There is an element of that, and I'm not fond
Mm-hmm.
of camping. I'm not fond of chemical toilets. I'm not fond of half-cooked vegan burgers. Any of these things are just not me. But there is also the way that outdoors music gets kind of blowing in the wind. It gets carried away. It doesn't have the intensity. I saw Bob Marley twice. I saw him in Crystal Palace, which was an outdoor gig, and it wasn't very impressive. I saw him in the Rainbow, and it was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen, because it's much more intensified when you're in a room. When gigs, and particularly daytime gigs, don't do it for me. It's got to be at night in a relatively small enclosed space, when you're shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours. I don't want anyone kind of, and also people go to Glastonbury. Glastonbury's sold out next year, and people don't know who's on the bill. So they haven't gone to see music or hear music. They've gone to go to Glastonbury. And that's just not my thing, really. I don't get it. A lot of those people were standing on their shoulders dancing to that Australian bloke with his wobble board who ended up in prison as a pedophile. I mean, are you really a fan of his? Do you really love Two Little Boys that much? No, you don't.
Well, I will say that while I agree with a lot of that, I'm a bit fonder of festivals than you are. And I had a peak moment at Latitude. It was twilight. There's a sort of bridge across a stream or lake. And just as I was crossing, I heard Kraftwerk were playing, and I heard the opening tones of The Model that was drifting over absolutely beautifully. So I think you can probably agree we can all have these moments that spring on us unexpectedly. I just heard that sort of far off tune throbbing towards me. It really was magical.
And those moments are really what it's often about. Often my favorite bit of any gig is that silence in between numbers, when there's that huge expectation of what comes next. Are they going to play that song you've been waiting for them to hear? Are you going to hear the opening chords of that? That moment, that kind of anticipation, which is collective, which we all feel. That's what we go to gigs for. What I go to gigs for. I want to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And that's why I love people like Van Morrison, who I go and see time and time and time again. And often he's useless. And sometimes he doesn't care at all, and he rarely talks to the audience, and he doesn't do encores, and he does exactly 90 minutes. But there's a real possibility that during a Van Morrison gig, there will be one of those moments when you all go, and the room goes completely silent, and you could hear a pin drop, and suddenly Van will kind of turn it on. He'll discover that Spanish concept of duende, this magic elf has suddenly entered the room. And that's that magical moment is what it's all about for me, really.
Well, that's brilliantly described in the book, and I've never heard it described in quite the way you do. That a spirit descends, and it cannot be controlled or commanded. If the time is right, it will appear. And
I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Spain, and I'm a big Hispanophile. I speak Spanish. I have a house there, and I've been to see a lot of flamenco, and duende is particularly associated with flamenco, and it's a concept we don't have in English, but the Spanish all understand it. That this spirit, this elf, this imp, this power, whatever you want to call it, kind of descends upon a performer and upon a performance and inhabits them. It's not that the performer is particularly charismatic or even necessarily particularly great, but that for a period of time, this magic has descended upon them and taken them over, possessed them, if you like. And they will know it, and suddenly they will start. It's almost like an auto singing. It's as if it comes from beyond, from somewhere unearthly. But we will also know it in the audience. We will know that the duende has arrived. And that is what we talk about when everyone, feels the hairs on their end. We feel that magic moment collectively. The Spanish have this word for that, this duende. I think it's a really important way of understanding what the great performers can do. They can't summon the duende because the duende decides to arrive of his own doing, but they can make themselves available to the duende. They can create the atmosphere, the way of being that this magic can arrive. I mean, I don't really believe in spirits and elves and imps, but I do believe that there's a magic beyond the human, if you like, almost, when great music reaches down into the soul.
You talk a lot also about Tom Waits, who is a different sort of performer in that everything seems sort of perfectly, do you mean planned, or, you know, it's a role that he plays. He's not kind of waiting for magic to descend. It's
no,
created
you're right
that way.
Tom Waits and Van Morrison are the other ends of the extreme. Van goes out there, doesn't give a damn about the audience, doesn't have any props, doesn't have any theatricality, doesn't talk to anybody, doesn't put on a show. He just bees Van, and he will sing some songs, and the magic might arrive. And if it doesn't, he doesn't care. He'll just leave and take the money. Tom Waits is the opposite of that. Tom Waits is a theatrical creation. From the every essence, every bit of him is made up. It's an invention. But the thing is, he's been being Tom Waits for so long that it no longer feels like an act. Because he's been doing it, you know, his entire creative life. He looked about 70 when he was 28. And he sung with that, you know, the voice of a ravaged old man when he was a very young man. And I've been lucky enough to see Tom Waits pretty much every time he's played in London, bar the first time. And he puts on the greatest show I've ever seen. It's wonky, it's kind of off kilter, it's out of focus, but it's magnificent. And it is very showbiz, if you like. And he will have neon lights blaring down on him, and he'll be leaning on a lamppost, and he'll have his hat at an angle. And, you know, and he does all these Tom Waits things that normally I wouldn't like very much, because I don't like theatre. But this kind of theatre seems so real. And having met him and interviewed him and had a fairly remarkable kind of afternoon in his presence in LA, I know that it's a 24-hour gig. He does 24-hour, 47, you know, every day, every minute of every day of every year, he is Tom Waits. And he puts on that show when you're in his presence. I don't know what he's like at home on the sofa, but whenever you're with him, he's being Tom Waits. And it's a fantastic show.
I mean, theatre is something else, you know, as well as being very enthusiastic about certain things, you are very unenthusiastic about other things. And I thought it was very funny, your little rant about theatre, which you do not like that much.
No, I keep trying. Every now and then I go, because I know everyone tells me that theatre's wonderful. And obviously it's very esteemed in our cultural kind of hierarchy. You know, serious theatre is right up there, whereas music is sort of somewhere down here. But I can always tell that they're acting. To me, so I know that at the end of the night, they're going to be slagging off the director and worrying about the last tube home to Muswell Hill. Because that's what actors do. They're just pretending. And I need to believe the performer. So what I particularly can't stand is musical theatre, because it's so clearly, they don't mean the song. They just, do you know what I mean? They've come in just to sing that song because it's in the play, and they're going to do that stage school voice that they all do, which is all too exaggerated. And there'll be jazz hands, and there'll be all of that. They are not Otis Redding. Do you know what I mean? You don't believe it comes from the soul. There's no soul in any of that. And even though it's my failing, every time I go to the theatre, I find myself looking at the cornicing on the ceiling and just hoping that they don't sing. Because if they sing, I'm going to have to leave, because it's going to be so painful. You know, whereas we just lost Shane McGowan. Shane didn't exactly have a theatrically trained voice. But he's an incredibly charismatic performer. You believe that he meant every single one of those wonderful words that he wrote. All those people in musical theatre, I don't believe they mean a single word of any of it. You know, who could really believe any of the songs in Les Miserables? I mean, you can't.
Well, at least as a set, you can whistle the set. I mean, I had a very bad evening at ABBA, the musical, when it was quite new. Because the trouble with that is, you know, those ABBA songs, whatever you think of them, their voices are just absolutely sublime.
Yeah.
Two women in ABBA. And then you have somebody, and I'm not going to do the impersonation, but imagine those songs done with a kind of jazz hands, showbiz way. It was
I had a similar thing
utterly painful.
there's a Bob Dylan play called Girl from the North Country, which I went to see. And I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and I've seen him live many times. And he's another one who can be hot or cold, good or bad. You never know what you're going to get. But I went to see this play, and it's really well written. It's very intelligent. It's not just a jukebox musical. It's actually got a proper story, all of that stuff. It's really well acted. But the minute they start to sing, it just isn't, Bob Dylan's voice, shot as it is, croaky as it is, old as it is a million times better than this person who's been to RADA, because they're not Bob Dylan. And nor do they even, I literally wanted to run up the aisle screaming, stop, this is sacrilege. I can't be dealing with that. But I do try. And occasionally I'll go to the theatre and think, well, clearly he's a brilliant, or she is a brilliant actor. But I can see the edge of the stage. I know they're making it up. It's dress up and pretend.
There was a Rod Stewart musical. I mean, this is a long time ago, and it didn't last very long. And I went to see that. I was reviewing it. And I think the other awful thing is the way they queued up the songs. I mean, someone would say, well, I'm not doing that. Or, my name isn't Maggie May Jones or whatever. And they all ended up with a sort of ship scene at the end with all the cast dressed as sailors. I mean, that's
my idea of hell. I'm sorry, it really is. But put me in a little room. Last gig I went to was about a week ago, up in Stoke Newington in a little dive with a tiny stage with 4 brilliant jazz musicians, about 100 people there, and that was standing room only. That's and it's the sort of music my wife can't stand. It's what she calls nervous breakdown music. It was quite free jazz, quite far out. I love it. I love that. I'm watching creativity in front of my eyes. I like to think, I know it isn't, but I like to think that live music is live and it's improvised and it's made up on the spot. Now, I know that's not always the case by any means, but it's the reason that those very choreographed shows don't usually do it for me very well. I like to think that it's, in that ways, I like my music more like sport, because the whole point about sport is you never know the ending, that it's not preconceived. And for me, the greatest music isn't either. The greats can turn on a sixpence, can suddenly do something else, can call a new song, can do it in a different way. And I love that. I don't want to go and hear it's like it is on the record, because I could sit at home and listen to the record.
I mean, you weren't very keen on the wave of northern bands either, the gloomy northerners who, I mean, there's the sort of crunching of the slaughtering of sacred cows on every other page, I think.
Yeah, I think that was where Enemy and Me fell out. Gang of Four, New Order, I don't know, all those kind of rather, intentionally dreary northern kind of, it's an ill wind, by gum. Pull up a greatcoat and do it up to your neck. That's not my idea of a good night out, really, in all honesty. The Smiths, I never got the Smiths, putting aside his abhorrent politics, it's just moany. Whereas I like music with a bit of brio and a bit of gusto and a bit of kind of, so that stuff. And some people love it, and each to their own is a very important creed. As much as I might say this is what I like and this is what I not like, you will have what you like and what you don't like. I don't like heavy metal. I don't get it at all. Opera, no. The Queen, I don't get Queen. It's too bombastic. It's too big. But so each to their own. And I'm not saying these things are bad, but I was never one for dreary northerners.
You have some quite tender words for Amy Winehouse. Obviously a very troubled figure, and there's quite a sort of sad glimpse of her. You used to run into her in around Camden Town, looking a bit dishevelled. It's a sad story, isn't it? But you saw her quite early on, didn't you? Or she was on your show. Yeah, I
saw her earlier on because I knew her dad. This is a slightly odd story. I used to go and take a Turkish bath every Wednesday, and her dad, Mitch, was one of a group of cab drivers who used to go to the same Turkish bath. It's a really old place, Porchester Hall in West London. And at that stage, I used to go every week, and I got to know all the guys there. And there was this group of cab drivers who were very voluble and very loud, and and all of that. And one of them was Mitch. And he used to say to me, "You got to get my daughter on your radio show." And of course, people say stuff like that all the time, so you don't take very much notice. But then he gave me I think it must have been a CD. I was going to say a cassette, but I suspect it was a sort of self-done CD. And this was before the first album came out. And he said, "Here, give it a listen." And I did. And I was immediately, wow, he's not wrong. She can really sing. And at this stage, she hadn't released any records or anything. And then when before the first album came out, we got her on my radio show to sing live, and he came with her. And the very first moment, I mean, even before she started to sing, you realize she was an extraordinary character. She was sort of simultaneously a kind of a little girl, and yet she'd imbibed Billie Holiday and Dinah Washington and all of this stuff just somehow completely. And she started to sing, and you knew immediately. Every now and then, you know straight away that this one's got it. She hasn't just got it; she's got it, in spades. And she sang on my show, and everyone was blown away. And then the first album comes out, and then later on, I kind of stayed in touch, and she was very kind to me. She sent me a platinum disc when her second album came out for the help she said I'd given her in her career. She didn't need any help. She was magnificent, and I used to go and see her live every now and then. But we were also neighbours. We lived around the corner from each other in Camden, and I would see her about, usually going to the pub. I mean, her, not me. I mean, sometimes I was going to the pub, but she was always going to the pub. And you just saw her get that beehive get sort of droopier and droopier. She got thinner and thinner. She got more and more. But she always said hello. She always had a smile. And I just think, she was hounded to her death by the press, in all honesty. She clearly had demons. She clearly had great issues. But she was probably the greatest talent I've witnessed emerge in the time that I've been doing my job. I think she was phenomenal, and she should have been helped when she was being pilloried, and that's I think it's unforgivable the way that she was treated. And then sadly the news came through that she died, and you weren't surprised, but it was still a shock. It was still a blow to the system, because I think she's probably the greatest British female vocalist of all time, and songwriter as well. I mean, there was so much more to come.
And there's a kind of sad moment. We've mentioned him before, but you say, thank God Shane MacGowan is still with us at the end of the book, and of course he isn't anymore.
No.
But you saw the Pogues.
Many.
One of the great frontmen.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I knew Shane well by any means, but I'd known him for a very long time. We'd been at the same punk gigs, when we were kids. I mean, he's a year older than me. And so when he was sort of 17, I was 16, and I'd seen him at all those gigs. And then I saw his first band, the Nips, Nipple Erectors, the Nips, a couple of times. I wasn't very impressed. They were sort of shambolic and not particularly good. But he used to work in a record shop that I used to go to a lot, and we'd talk about music and stuff. And then he said to me, "I've got this new band called Pogue Mahone. You must come and see us." I didn't see their first gig. I think I saw about the third gig that they ever did. And again, they were another one. Immediately, Shane had found his voice and his vehicle. And I'd grown up, I'm not Irish, although my dad's mum was Irish, but I'm not Irish, I'm English. But I'd grown up on the Edgware Road, pretty much. I'd grown up near Cricklewood and Kilburn and all of what was then a very Irish community. So I grew up with all those kids who'd been Irish at a difficult time when bombs were being dropped and, the IRA and all of that. And I saw what it meant to them, that he'd suddenly given them a voice. He was telling their stories, and he was doing it so brilliantly. And some of those early Pogues gigs, when Shane was still kind of on top of his addictions, were just phenomenal. I saw them and the Dubliners in Kilburn at the Kilburn National on St. Patrick's night in about 86, I think, 85, 86. And it is one of the most joyous, rowdy, kind of, remarkable Cayleys I've ever been to. And it was a good night to have red hair, which I sort of still had back then. Even though I wasn't Irish, I could pass as. And it was a great night. But I also interviewed Shane, and that was dangerous. I interviewed Shane for The Face. It was the first major piece on them by anybody. And I interviewed, we met in a pub called the Crown in Cricklewood, and it was him and Spider Stacey from the band and maybe one or two of the others. And I interviewed him. I met him on a Thursday afternoon, and the interview was still going on Saturday, and I hadn't been to bed yet, and nor had anybody else. And at one point I was carried by Spider Stacey to the next pub. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I mean, you know, and there were the seeds of the fact that we lost Shane recently. But he contributed a lot. A lot of these people, although you can be sad about them, and, you know, and Amy is sad and Shane's sad, they left behind great music. And they left behind, for those who saw them live, amazing memories.
Someone else who, I mean, it is a sort of melancholy book in parts, as well as an utterly joyous book. That's part of the whole story. And I mean, a lot of the music is melancholy, but I really loved the anecdote of you playing football, albeit briefly, with Bob Marley.
Truth be told, I didn't play football at all. I was invited to go and play football with Bob Marley by a guy called Rob Partridge, who was my very close friend, and who was his press officer at Island Records. And I went down to, it was Battersea Park, I think. I can't remember what year it was, in all honesty. But I arrived in a sort of pair of cut-down jeans and training shoes, thinking it would be a little kickabout. And there was Bob Marley and a load of his kind of Rasta mates. And the game had already started. And they were taking it very, very seriously. And they all had their kit on, and they were really clearly very good footballers. And I immediately developed, my mate Rob said, "You're going to go and play?" And I immediately developed a hamstring strain or something, and just sat on the side and watched, because I was way out of my league. I mean, it was not, you know. But yeah, so Bob Marley in Battersea Park. But I mean, I've been lucky enough to meet lots of great musicians and famous people. And do you know what? Most of them are all right. They're more than all right. Most of them are decent and fine. And there's almost a bit of a rule. It's not entirely true, but usually the more famous they are, the nicer they are. Yeah. Because they've got nothing to prove. You know, they've done it. They're there. They're not. Whereas the worst are often kind of young American bands who think they're the next best thing from God and are on their first tour of Britain, and you know, and they can be a right pain in the posterior. But not just Americans, but the big artist Tony Bennett called me Sir. I mean, you know, that's like Tony Bennett. That's Tony Bennett. He just called me Sir. You know, it's like that sort. The big ones are usually great.
Yeah. Well, how do you remember all this stuff? I mean, do you have scrapbooks? Do you keep your ticket stubs? Do you? I mean, you did write down as a young lad the music that you played, I believe, which is a hilarious story.
You've definitely read the book. From about the age of 13 to 15 or something, I kept a diary of every record I played. So if I played, you know, at that time, the Motown record, I put that down, and I would, every time I put a record on, I would write it down in my diary. And I was pretentious, clearly, even back then. And at some point, one of my brothers, and I still don't know which one, it was probably both in cahoots, who were older than me, wrote down that I'd played a Bay City Rollers record, right, in my diary. And I went completely, what if people see this? They'll think I'm a Bay City Rollers fan. You know, it was like, they ruined my sort of years of keeping this astute diary. So I did keep that for a while, but I never did keep ticket stubs or anything. I didn't take photos, didn't have any of those things. To be honest, how do I remember it? Well, I say in the book that I have a photographic memory, but it only takes Polaroids. I can remember I can't remember them all, given that there are thousands, but all the sort of ones that really matter, I can remember being there. I can remember what it felt like. Sometimes I can't remember the venue. I usually can't remember the set list or anything else, but there will be a moment or two of each gig that has been somehow kind of imprinted upon my memory. And it's been imprinted like a Polaroid. It's an image or a sensation. It's Michael Jackson's afro bobbing down at the start of ABC, or it's Rod picking up the mic stand and about to do Stay With Me, or it's, you know, Johnny Rotten with a hanky on his head, kind of snarling while he's singing Anarchy in the UK. It's these moments that I remember. And much more than what they did, I remember what I felt. I remember how excited I was to be at that gig, or how disappointed I was when, you know, Nina Simone spent most of the concert haranguing the audience and throwing her shoes at us. So So, but I can't remember where that was. I don't remember if
Mm.
it was Ronnie Scott's or it was the Royal Festival Hall, and because I think I went to both, and I can't. So I can only remember fragments, and I say that in the book, and it's a book of memory. So don't use it as a book of record, because it isn't that.
It's impressionistic, and I love the way that you do have these. You have these great phrases that are kind of, music journo phrases. Like you say the Clash with the Opus Dei of punk, and I'm not quite even sure what that means, but I just love that idea.
Well, I
And then
can
the
tell
other
you what
one, yeah, go on.
I can tell you what it means with the Clash. What it means to me, at least, is that they were true believers. They were. They would truck nothing outside of punk. They were political. They were, man in the revolution. They were zealots, if you like. And I was with them. And if you like the Clash, you couldn't possibly like soul music, pop music, anything else. You could only like what they did. And therefore, they were they were stern. They were quite stern. Joe Strummer was a sort of almost a sort of Che Guevara figure, if you like. I mean, they meant it, or he meant it, certainly. That's what I meant about they were the Opus Dei of punk.
The other great phrase, and again, we're going back to stadium rock, and you say that the Who and the Stones are the rock and roll bed blockers. in the sense that, sort of stopping other stuff coming through, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that, the hottest ticket in town is a bunch of octogenarians, when the Stones are playing, and that they're going to be the headline. If you are going to be going to Glastonbury, you're going to hoping that it's someone who's older than your granddad. Is kind of weird, when you put that in a rock and roll context. Because I grew up, the Clash used to sing No Beatles, Elvis or the Rolling Stones in 1977. Because they wanted to do away with everything that had gone before. It was all going to be new. It was all going to be ours. Well, that idea has gone completely now. It's all about these old blokes, and they're usually blokes. And as much as the Stones are a great band, I've got very little desire to go and see two of the remaining members, kind of, the original band, kind of trot out their hits from 50, 60 years ago. It just doesn't do it for me, really. Certainly, rock and roll should always be about the new and the exciting and the fresh and the raw. Jazz is a bit different, but particularly with rock music, I would rather go and see a young kid with high cheekbones who only knows 3 chords, but has got the attitude.
The other melancholy part of the book is the venues that have gone, and the opportunities that have gone. You're not entirely depressed about the whole situation of modern music, but one of the issues that you talk about is just how you were able to afford to go to things as really quite a young kid with just your milk round money.
Yeah, I mean, all those gigs where I went to see the Clash, for example, I saw them like 7 times on the White Riot tour or whatever. I don't think any of the tickets were more than 50p. Now, 50p then is not the same as now, but that's probably only the equivalent of a tenner at the very most, not even that. And you could go and, you could go out night after night and go and see bands for pence. And you would be seeing, literally, I think in 1 week, I could have seen the Clash, Ian Dury, the Jam. I mean, and the list goes on. And I did. And you could see them all in relatively small venues for close to nothing. And that was normal back then. Now, the most expensive ticket for Roxy Music at the O2 recently was £700. I mean, a ticket to go, I saw Elton John at Wembley for £3.50. If you'd have gone to see a recent gig at Wembley, tickets were £350. People are being priced out. It's big. Kids can't go to gigs, and lots of them. They save up and go to 1 or 2 a year or something. And a similar thing's happening with football, I'm afraid. It's become corporatized. It's become monetized. And that for me is very sad. Now, it doesn't mean you can still go to or I can, because I'm lucky to live in London. I don't know if it's true elsewhere. You can still go and see gigs in local pubs and stuff like that. If you're old enough to get in, That's another thing. We don't let kids into licensed venues anymore. My kids had to forge things just to go and see a band. I helped them because I was going to see pub gigs when I was 14. I wasn't drinking any beer. I couldn't afford it, but I was in there watching Dr. Feelgood. You can't. That experience is really hard to find now, and the smaller venues have been taken out, and the prices have gone up and up and up. And I just think that's a real shame because it cuts off that experience to so many people.
I suppose you're in a particularly privileged position, and that what most people would say, I guess, is how would I find out about these little backstreet places in Dalston where there's only 20 people? I mean, I used to work for Time Out, and at least with Time Out, you could get your music listings, and there'd be tons of stuff in there. Presumably, you're on the grapevine.
I think it is. In some ways, it's harder and it's easier now. The internet has obviously made access to everything easier. It's all there on the internet if you want to know where to look. But you don't have, I don't think, the skilled kind of guides. I was guided by Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill, or I was guided by Danny Baker and, the NME writers and whatever it might be. I used to avariciously read those. And if they said there's this band called Television from America that are great, I'd be in the line to get the ticket and all of that sort of stuff. I think that's harder now. Who to trust on this matter? It's more difficult. But you see, I say, like all music, it is a form of karma. The more you put in, the more you get back. So the more you do your research, the more you read about it, whether it's jazz or it's soul or it's reggae or it's heavy metal or whatever's your thing, the more you immerse yourself in it. And if you go to gigs, someone next to you will say, "Oh, have you seen that band? They're a bit like this, only they're even better." So if you put yourself into that world, it's out there and you will find the information. It will come to you, if you like.
Yeah, you can kind of follow the string.
You can, exactly that. And I am very lucky because I do get to lots of gigs for nothing. I don't have to pay to go, but I still pay for quite a few of them. But sometimes I'm on the guest list and that helps without any doubt whatsoever. But I guess it's also if it's a priority for you. I'll tend to be I don't go to theatre very much. I've sort of stopped going to the cinema almost. My thing is going to see live bands. And if I haven't seen a band for 2 weeks, I start to sort of shake a bit and think I need to get a fix of live music.
You have a little bit of a rant about what's happened to Tin Pan Alley, I noticed, which, so some of the book, maybe not too much of the book, but quite a bit of it is about what we've lost. And we've certainly lost Tin Pan Alley and all its memories.
Yeah, Denmark Street, which is in the benighted area of St Giles, which has almost been wiped off the map really by a kind of redevelopment. The northern end of Charing Cross Road on the opposite side to Soho was the home of the British music industry. It was the home of every guitar shop where people went in and played the solo from Smoke on the Water. It was the home of publishers and little backstreet kind of bars and gigs, and it's been wiped out and it's been corporatized and it's been commercialized and it's been replaced with glitzy kind of contemporary technology, and it's horrible. It feels like you're in Dubai. Whereas once it was you see, I kind of like my music a bit grubby, and because I think it should be earthy, and the more you make it swish, and the further away you take it from people, in these big glitzy venues where you've paid X amounts of £100 for a VIP ticket, whatever that might mean, and that's just not for me. It's putting layers between you and the creative process, and I want to be as close up and as involved as I possibly can.
So you can sweat a bit in your nice suit, but just as long as you don't get mud on it.
I mean, I'm old now, so I like to sit down usually in gigs. The knees can't quite take, long standing up concerts. And of course, I'm probably, if the Clash came along now, I don't know whether I would get it. I would hope I would, but I might be complaining about them, but I still want to feel that what I'm listening to or what I'm watching or what I'm, experiencing somehow matters, that it means something, that it isn't just showbiz. I've never been into showbiz. I can't stand Saturday night TV. I don't want talent contests. Do you know what I mean? It's like I've got to believe that the musicians mean it and that they're doing it not just for the money. And therefore, going to see, that's why jazz, because no jazz people have ever made any money. That's why going to see jazz is always, for me, a great experience. Because even if it's terrible, you know it's real. Whereas going to see, I don't know, Little Mix or whatever they're called, or I don't know, the Spice Girls again or something. Really? I mean, yeah, you can sing along, you know, it's great. If that's for you, perfect. But don't ask me to get involved in stuff like that.
Do you find when you go to certain gigs that there's sort of younger audience members just kind of looking at you askance a bit, sort of, what's he doing here?
I had an experience of that recently. A friend of mine, and he's 20 now. He's my friend's son, and he's been. I've been close to him since the day he was born, and I've sort of tutored his musical taste. I bought him my top 10 albums that I loved when I was 18 for his 18th birthday, and so he got Television and Patti Smith and Velvet Underground and The Clash and whatever. And he's a musician now, and he's got a band. And I went and saw him play in a scuzzy little room above a pub in Chalk Farm. And I was queuing up to go in, and I was paying. I didn't even want to get on the guest list. I thought I'll give him my tenner. I was queuing up to go in, and I was literally 3 times the age of everybody else in the queue, because I'm in my 60s and they were teenagers. And I might have been 4 times the age of some of them. I was literally old enough to be their great-grandparent, just about. And when I got to the front, there was a sort of a stern-looking Eastern European doorman, kind of with an earpiece and, and a bit of muscle. And he said to me, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" I said, "Yeah, I've come to see my friend's band. They're playing tonight." And I got a stamp on my hand. And I went up and, and the beer was all over the floor and the walls were sticky. And it was great. I loved it.
I'm not sure if you have a tough doorman that... do you know who I am kind of thing really works.
I didn't say those words, I promise.
Okay, well, that's been very good fun talking to you about this book, Live, Why We Go Out. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I love the opinionated nature of your response to music and your passion and love. I'm going to ask you 3 questions that I ask everybody. So I hope you've been having a think. What is your favourite artwork, Robert?
It's a room of artworks. It's the Rothko room at the Tate. It's the Seagram murals. And every time I stand in front of them, I almost literally burst into tears. I don't understand why. It's a bit like jazz, I guess. It's kind of abstract and it's beautiful and it's spiritual. And I can just gaze at those paintings with their layers and depths of colour forever and ever and ever. If I had to live in that room, I'd be a very happy man.
That's a great choice. Now, we haven't spoken much about books, and you do go out a lot. I imagine you do read from time to time. You can read. What have you missed out on that you think you should have read by now? Is there anything?
Yeah, there is. And I've tried to read it about half a dozen times. And I seem to get to page 120 every single time. And I've never got any further. And that's Don Quixote. Because of my love of Spain.
Yes, of course.
I really feel I ought to have read their great kind of foundation work. And I know it's wonderful. And every time I start it, I think this is wonderful. And I just never get beyond like 100 pages. It is incredibly dense and very it wanders off on tangents. And I've tried, God knows I've tried. And every year I sort of say to myself, right, this year you're going to get through Don Quixote. I usually take it away on my summer holidays. And I just end up, putting it down after 100 pages and it gets forgotten. So one day I will read Don Quixote by Cervantes.
So what do you read otherwise? Do you have a particular style or genre or author that you can get beyond page 100?
I read the most unfashionable books. I read books by sort of tough American white men. Richard Ford. I've read every single word Richard Ford has ever written. I love Hemingway. It's really out of fashion, Hemingway, but I just think as a stylist, it's unbeatable. I mean, he's just phenomenal. I loved Cormac McCarthy. I like those kind of intense American, quite muscular writers. Really, they're sort of my thing. That and Agatha Christie.
Oh yeah, you can whiz through an Agatha Christie, can't you?
I love an Agatha Christie. Absolutely. I also love Sherlock Holmes, which I reread on a regular basis. But.
Good choices. Finally, I mean, I know when you were writing for the Face and so on, feedback is a very interesting thing, isn't it? And I suppose for style journalists, people sort of think maybe you're a bit above yourself. My question is, what's the weirdest or oddest bit of feedback you've ever had, really from any aspect of your career?
This was not weird or odd in a negative sense, actually. This was, and it's a story I relate in the book. For years, Paul Weller and I didn't speak to each other for whatever reason. There'd been a bit of a falling out somewhere in the past over nothing whatsoever. And we were often sort of in the same milieu, and we're the same sort of age, similar kind of backgrounds. But it wasn't an antagonism, but we just didn't get on really. And then I wrote a book called The Way We Wore, which is about clothes. It was the first of a trilogy. The Way We Wore, London Made Us, and Now Live. And this was the book about shoes and trousers and all of that sort of stuff. And I wrote this book, and I got a handwritten letter passed through a mutual friend from Paul Weller saying, I've just read The Way We Wore. It's the story of my life. Why is it that we don't talk? I can't remember. And so when I just thought, what a big man to do that. And I wrote back saying, well, no, nor can I, and I would love to talk, it'd be an honor. And since then, we're not bosom buddies, but we've become friends and we see each other. I saw him last week, actually, at a gig, Stone Foundation gig. And so that was the most memorable response ever to a book. And it wasn't one I expected. It was completely out of the blue. And I just thought, what a sort of a big, he proved he was a big man doing that, really.
I'm just looking at, see if I can find this Hard Times again. Oh, yeah, I thought I would just hold this up because, so that's you back in the day.
A very good quiff.
It's a fantastic quiff, yeah. Oh, it's really good, yeah.
That was my brief kind of rockabilly period, really.
Yeah. Yes, I just thought that maybe when you're out and about being, the style journalist, there might be people kind of going, cool, look at him, who does he think he is?
Oh, I've had loads of that. I've had not so much now, but I've had it all. I get that quite often. That's just water off a duck's back.
Yeah.
And then there's people, oftentimes people come up and say, what is it you've got against the Beatles? Beatles fans get very agitated because I'm not a Beatles fan. But to be honest, particularly with radio, normally people are really nice because radio is a very intimate medium. And if they decide to tune into you for a bit, you're kind of sharing your life with them. And so being, I was on the radio every day for 27 years or something. And loads of people come up and say, you helped me get through when my mum died, or when you played that record, it was really important, or whatever. And that stuff is lovely. And occasionally you get the opposite, but only really, really occasionally.
Yeah. Oh, we don't need to stress the negative. I love the Paul Weller story. Maybe he kind of associated you with Spandau. I mean,
it was all about that. He was there was sort of two camps, and we were in separate camps. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the other things. I wrote some poetry for Spandau Ballet when I was 18, and people still quote it back to me as if this is like that was my life's work. I was a teenager, for God's sake.
That was your little intro, wasn't it?
Yeah. Which I am unduly proud, actually, even though it's nonsense.
It's good nonsense, especially by a teenager, And really, whenever we look back, especially to our musical and sartorial enthusiasms, there has to come a a time where you sort of go, why did I wear that? Or why did I say
No,
that?
you see,
And it's part of being...
why did I say that? Yeah, I've had a
Yeah.
fair few. Why did I say that? But why did I wear that? No, I don't regret a single pair of silly trousers, or or ridiculous haircut or anything else, because that was part of my story. It was the I've always thought that what you wear is your outward manifestation of who you are. And I've been all of those things, because that's how life is. You go through lots of different stages.
Yeah.
And every single one of those trousers has some great music to go with it.
Well, I think that's the takeaway. I mean, if you get the trousers right, everything else falls into place, maybe.
It's true. I mean, I actually describe all those youth culture, punk, mod, skinheads, soulboy, neurotic. I describe them as trouser tribes, because that's kind of what they are, really. And they have a musical accompaniment that goes with it. I don't know if kids do that anymore as much.
Yeah, well, I remember quite recently I put on an old pair of jeans, and they were rather more flared. I think they were called boot cuts.
Yes,
and
I know
suddenly
that.
I was kind of wearing flares and feeling a bit, like the Bee Gees were my soundtrack. It was, So change your trousers, change your life.
Exactly.
I think that will be the motto. Right, I will let you go, Robert. Thank you so much for joining me in the book bag, being a musical magpie. Best of luck with the book. It is an absolutely terrific read. Thank you for your memories.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. So yet again, live by Robert Elms, Why We Go Out. Fantastic book, full of anecdotes and brilliant music writing, and just brilliant writing about the last 40 years or so in culture. So join me again next time. In the meantime, won't you please like and subscribe? That helps us keep going. Thank you, and see you again soon. Goodbye.